last march begins. A letter runs swifter than any blade, carrying a truth long hidden. Before the black gate, shadows rise in mockery, and a father waits for the answer of centuries. Tonight, let us follow until the circle closes and home is found again. Chapter 12. Aragorn never felt he was unintelligent until that moment. The missing prince of Mirkwood, he muttered to himself. He closed his eyes, feeling very much like a fool. Why hadn't he thought of it before? Legolas, he murmured again. He opened his eyes and met the cold gaze of the Elven King. Legolas is your son, the prince. He heard of the story maybe only a handful of times growing up, but he still should have realized the coincidence of finding a lost elf from Mirkwood and knowing of a lost elf from Mirkwood, especially after Hadir recognized Legolas, for it must have been him that informed the king about Legolas with that letter. Though how the king knew of the battle at the Black Gate, Aragorn wondered but knew it wasn't important at that moment. What? Gimli lowly grumbled in a disbelieving tone. King Thranduil ignored Gimli completely. Yes, my son Legolas. Where is he? He ordered more forcefully. Aragorn could tell the Elven King's patience were dwelling on the very edge, and knew the answer would most likely push him over. He sighed and shook his head. Legolas left King Thranduil. The Elven King's mouth thinned. When? Not long. He's heading for Mirkwood. The king seemed to perk up from that information, and Aragorn felt inclined to tell him why. Legolas didn't know where he came from, your highness, but he had with him arrows he had carved that looked mighty similar to that of your realm. I told him he may be from Mirkwood, and he had a desire to go almost as soon as I said so. However, he felt duty-bound to finish this quest with me and Gimli. The quest is now over, and so he left, in search of his family. He'll be better off not knowing them, Gimli interrupted. King Thranduil turned his cold gaze to him, his face becoming more hardened at the sight of a dwarf. You are not worth my time or attention, dwarf. So, stay out of my affairs, he said, in a low, dangerous tone, before he turned away from them and started giving orders to his warriors. Gimli stepped forward to give the king a tongue-lashing, but Aragorn stopped him by grabbing his shoulder. Enough, Gimli. You are not helping. Why don't you assist Éomer with preparing for the march back? Gimli grumbled under his breath, but didn't move from his spot by Aragorn's side. Nola Finwë, gather the wounded, King Thranduil ordered. An exhausted elf stood at attention and nodded. Elros, prepare the warriors for our return home. Another fatigued elf nodded as well and left to do as he was told. Lissasul, realizing that the king was ready to march right back to Mirkwood, Aragorn quickly stepped forward and spoke quietly to him. King Thranduil, your warriors are tired. They need rest. Come with us to Minas Tirith. Rest. Get supplies. You and your warriors need it. We can help you with those too wounded to move across Middle-earth. King Thranduil glared down at him. It's my son, Lord Aragorn. It's your people, your warriors. Calmly, Aragorn said, and he will be there when you return. Legolas is weary of a traveler's life. He wants to settle down in a home with family. He wouldn't leave Mirkwood so hastily, not without discovering something about himself. Look at your warriors, King Thranduil. Aragorn glanced at the warriors. All of them, men and elf alike. They were slowly dragging their feet to help the wounded and form a formation to return to Minas Tirith. Éomer was directing the men. They need rest, and so do you, Thranduil King. After we get to Minas Tirith, you will be able to send a messenger to Mirkwood to inform them of your son's arrival. He turned back to the King of Mirkwood. King Thranduil was assessing his warriors, noticing the same weary look in the eyes that Aragorn noted. He nodded reluctantly, inwardly fighting between pride and need. "As soon as we get to Minas Tirith, I want a messenger to travel to my home." Aragorn nodded, accepting the arrangement easily. "It will be done," he promised. King Thranduil nodded before leaving to inform his warriors of the plan. Gimli came up next to Aragorn and sneered. "I never liked that elf, Ishkakwi." "If you're going to curse him," Aragorn interrupted as he gave the dwarf a look, "don't do it in my presence." Gimli grumbled something under his breath before saying out loud, "I can't believe Legolas is related to that elf. You sure he isn't lying? That king," he spat out, as if it was a curse, "is bad news. I wouldn't be surprised if he is lying about Legolas being his son. That's just the type of thing he would do, that attention grabbing." "He's as truthful, Gimli," Aragorn interrupted. "I should have seen it long ago. The story of the missing prince of Mirkwood just didn't cross my mind." Before they could continue the conversation, Éomer came up to them. "The men are ready to move out. We got the wounded secured. What should we do with the dead?" Aragorn sighed and glanced down at a random body that laid lifeless not far from them. "Leave them. We would send out a team to bring their bodies home once we return. We don't have the resources or energy to bring them home with us." He stared at the fiery mountain of Mount Doom. He could barely see the eagles flying over the hot lava. Hopefully, Gandalf would be able to return with Sam and Frodo. He turned from the sight. "Let's go before King Thranduil gets impatient." Gimli grumbled under his breath again at the mention of the king's name, but Aragorn ignored him. Over 2 weeks later, found Thranduil pacing outside the young hobbit's sick room, waiting for Mithrandir to come out. In his hand, he held an arrow. He was irritated and frustrated. He was leaving for home bright and early tomorrow, and no one would tell him otherwise. Mithrandir had talked him out of returning home each time Thranduil had brought it up, reminding him of his duty to his warriors who were too ill to leave their beds. Thranduil was getting impatient. Depending on his speed of travel, Legolas could be halfway or over halfway to Mirkwood by now, and the messenger would be days behind him. He waited this long to have Legolas back in his embrace. Why should he wait any longer? The door opened, and Thranduil turned his attention back to it. But it was only Aragorn who stepped out. The man paused when he saw him and stepped aside. Behind him was Mithrandir, looking weary but strong. Aragorn quietly closed the door behind them. Mithrandir sighed knowingly when he saw him, but otherwise waited for him to speak quietly. "I spoke to my warriors," Thranduil said. "I'll take a few with me and start our journey home tomorrow." Aragorn's eyes widened. "Home? King Thranduil, what about those still too ill to walk?" "They will be staying here until they are well again. I hope you don't mind." Aragorn shook his head. "I don't mind at all, King Thranduil." "Thranduil, my friend," Mithrandir started to say. Thranduil quickly interrupted, not caring for the soft tone the Istar was using. He held up the arrow in his hand. "The only time I saw my son in 2,000 years, he was shooting this into a troll's head and saving my life. In a flash, he was gone again, in the mist of gore and screams. Do not tell me to wait an extra week or a few days, Mithrandir. I am going, and I do not need your permission to do so," he snapped. "King Thranduil," Aragorn interrupted calmly. "This belongs to Legolas." He reached for a dagger in his belt. He held it out for Thranduil to take. "I found it after the battle. I know not whether Legolas has the matching dagger with him." Thranduil stared at the familiar dagger laying innocently in Aragorn's hands. He reached out and took hold of the hilt of the dagger. It was one of the daggers he gave Legolas. He had them this whole time. For the 2,000 years Legolas had been gone, He had a piece of home with him. It warmed Thranduil's heart. He tightened his hold on the hilt and gave the man a tight, thankful nod. He turned and left to finish preparing his warriors for the trip home. By late morning, King Thranduil and a few of his most rested warriors had left Minas Tirith. It took several weeks, but Legolas was proud of himself for finally making it to the forest of Mirkwood. He barely stopped to rest during all that time. The only time he did stop was so Arod could rest. His eagerness to find who he was and his family pushed him far beyond his usual limits. He was tired and hungry as a result, but it was well worth it. He stood just at the borderline of the forest, looking in. He had never dared pass the border before because of the evil that stank the forest. But it was different this time. Evil still coated it, but it felt weaker than the last time he stood at its border. He was sure it was because of Mordor's fall. Since that moment, the air felt lighter and freer. There was no longer any suffocating darkness in the air. "Come on, Arod. Let's do this, boy," he muttered to his horse as he urged him forward. The horse trotted into the forest, and it felt like they entered a dark vale. The trees blocked out the sun, and large spider webs coated the branches. Legolas reached out and patted Arod's neck soothingly. "It is well, Arod. Everything is all right. Just stay on the path," he said, glancing down at the rough wooden path that would lead him straight towards Mirkwood. This place almost made him glad he hadn't lived in Mirkwood. Almost. How could the elves last under such evil? And the evil was already thinning here. Legolas couldn't imagine living there when it was at its peak. It took several more days to cross the forest to the Mirkwood Kingdom, near the mountains. It was a quiet, tense walk. Arod had seemed unsure about walking beneath the dark branches of the Mirkwood trees. Several times, the horse almost wandered off the path in his aggravation. Legolas was about to get Arod to stay on the path and not wander off. He whispered encouraging words into Arod's ears. The closer they got the kingdom, the slowly they seemed to walk. Legolas felt something in the air, a faint smell of death and smoke. It wasn't until they were a day away from the kingdom that the elf bumped into the first body. It was an orc with several arrows protruding from its back. Legolas jumped down from Arod's back and approached the orc. He had to use his sleeve to cover his nose from the stench coming off the decomposing carcass. He knelt down and took one of the arrows out of the body to examine it. The wood was unpainted and very light. Legolas looked towards the base, where the feathers were so evenly spaced. There, Legolas gently traced the carved leaf with his thumb. Mirkwood must be his home. Where else could he have gotten an arrow from Mirkwood? Arod neighed lightly behind him, bring him back to the present. He looked behind and grinned at the uncomfortable horse. He dropped the arrow and stood. "Yes, Arod, it is a rather unpleasant odor. Let us continue." Walking alongside Arod, Legolas led the horse forward and away from the carcass. But the smell of decomposing carcasses and smoke didn't stay behind them. It got stronger the closer they walked towards the Elvish kingdom. They came across more and more bodies of orcs, spiders, and wargs. It wasn't until a league more that they came across a different body. Legolas gasped and rushed forward, kneeling down to feel for a pulse on the elf's neck, but there was none. He stared at the elvish warrior. The elf was laying on his back in the middle of the path. Around him were at least 3 orc carcasses. There was one dark arrow in the shoulder of the elf, and another one embedded in his leg. Neither arrows would have been fatal. Legolas carefully took out the arrow in the elf's leg and stared at the tip. He held it close to his nose and snuff. A pungent odor came from it and tickled his nose. Legolas quickly dropped the arrow and made a disgusted face. Poison, he muttered, looking back down at the elf. He reached forward and felt the skin of the lifeless elf. Still warm, he died not long ago. His heart ached in pain of one's life. He tried to picture the end, what the elf would have gone through, dying here, alone. He would have been in deep pain and agony for at least a day, as the poison ravished his system and slowly killed him. Death would have been a welcome. He had no one there to comfort him through it. He was alone. Arad bumped his shoulder comfortingly with his head. Legolas reached up and patted his nose. Yes, Arad, let us move on. He stood, but paused as he glanced down at the body. Someone would be missing him, he said quietly to himself. He glanced at Arad. Do you mind carrying him, Arad? We should make sure he gets home. As an answer, Arad got down on his knees and waited. Legolas smiled at his horse's kind heart before picking up the elf's body and carefully placing him on Arad's back. Thank you, my dear friend, he said to Arad. They walked through the rainy night. Legolas' hood was over his head, but that did little to protect him from the rain. Neither one of them, Legolas or Arad, wished to make camp with bodies of repugnant orcs and spiders around. He also wanted to make it to the kingdom as soon as possible. Legolas wanted to return the elf to his friends and family. He needed to make sure they knew what happened to him. He knew what it was like, not knowing, and he didn't want that to happen to this elf's family. They must have been an hour away from the kingdom when Legolas heard voices, some sorrowful and others more commanding. There were a lot of tree movement up ahead. He could hear the branches moving, the rustling of leaves. He paused to listen, but he couldn't make out any words. He glanced around, his heart heavy with the evidence of a fierce battle. He couldn't see any bodies of elves. They must have already taken care of their own, but he could see leftover weapons, swords, broken arrows, bows, daggers. There was smoke rising from the burning of the orcs' bodies. The ground was still soaked with the black blood of orc and red blood of elves. The grass had been heavily trampled on. There were many indents from heavy footwear on the path Legolas walked. A few minutes later, Legolas could see the domed kingdom up ahead. He paused and eyed the structure. He had, of course, heard about what the elves did to keep themselves protected from the spiders and orcs. The elves long ago had asked the trees to wall up the city, but then the spiders came. They attacked them from above almost 70 years ago. To protect themselves from the spiders, they asked the trees to encase them in a dome-like structure. Against the mountains, the structure hid and protected the elves. The dome was made from trees and branches. It was the perfect concealment from enemies' eyes. It blended in with the surrounding. However, there were several holes in the dome. From the battle, he was sure. Elves were gathered around, trying to fix them, calling on the forest for help and aid as they guided the moving branches to the appropriate spot in the wall. There was a group of warriors not far, talking quietly amongst themselves, their faces serious and their eyes alert. Smoke rose in the distance, the burning of the enemy's carcasses. Legolas sighed, knowing he would grab their attention the moment he moved. Let's get this done, he muttered quietly before taking a step forward. As expected, the warriors quickly turned their attention to him. Halt! Who goes there? One of the warriors shouted in common tongue. Legolas held up his hands in surrender. Just a friend, he said in Elvish from beneath his hood. The warriors made their way over to him with their swords drawn. I found one of your missing comrades a day back. He nodded towards his horse. I had to bring him home. One of the warriors approached the horse and gasped. Lenwe, he yelled, as he rushed forward to take the dead warrior from Aerod's back. He laid the fallen elf down and went to check his pulse. "I am sorry," Legolas said as he watched him. "He was already gone when I found him." The warrior sighed when he couldn't find a pulse. He looked up at his other comrades. "Who will tell his wife?" he asked softly. Another warrior returned his sword to his side and gave a thankful nod to Legolas. "Thank you, friend, for returning him home. His wife worried so. She will take painful comfort to know what happened to him." One of the warriors, who went by the name of Thranduil, led Legolas into the Dome Kingdom. Legolas found himself not minding the enclosed space. It had a very much different feel to it than that of a cavern made of rock and stone. It didn't feel so isolated, nor did he feel trapped. He was able to feel the outside air, hear the birds chirping, and feel the earth beneath his feet. There was life in the air. Inside was darkened by the lack of natural sunlight, but the elves had magical orbs around, casting a very realistic sunlight. He would much rather feel the natural sunlight on his face, but if it came down to it, Legolas was sure he could picture this place as home. He took a deep breath and was able to smell the trees. It was very calming and peaceful. After dropping Lenwa off at the House of Healing to be prepared to be laid to rest, Galadriel left to find a Captain Irinian. Finding it unnecessary to stay, Legolas left to explore the kingdom and find some hint to his identity. He kept his face covered with his hood, unsure about revealing himself to strangers. Aerod walked beside him. The kingdom was solemnly quiet as elves mourned their dead. Some of the elves were singing a soft lament for those who lost their lives. Legolas could see evidence of the battle on the trees that housed the elves. Unlike the elves in Rivendell, the woodland elves lived in the trees, the same trees that had stretched forth their limbs to create the leafy cavern. It was a majestic sight, one Legolas never seen before as he walked on the forest floor. He stopped at a tree trunk and glanced up. The tree was huge. It looked almost as tall as the ancient trees of Fangorn Forest, and just as wide. The branches of the very top of the tree had stretched out to touch the limbs of the neighboring trees, creating a barrier from the outside world. Between the barrier and the ground, the branches of the tree have been twisted and turned to create a home for the woodland elves. Vines hanging from the tree created a surprisingly sturdy and immovable ladder. Legolas stepped closer and touched one of the vines. It looked like the vine had been molded into the trunk of the tree, fastening it into place. He glanced back up to study the vines connecting from one tree to the other. He could see elves walking along it and realized it was a bridge, a complex bridge system, making it possible for elves to move from one tree to another. However, that did not stop the elves from walking on the forest floor. Legolas glanced around and took note of the elves walking on the ground. The elves of Mirkwood had shops and other structures there, such as the House of Healing. Behind him stood the mountain wall, curved out to form the palace of the king, and a mighty fortress in case the enemy break through the dome. 2 warriors stood guard over the entrance. They looked weary but alert. 2 warriors that would not slack at their rather boring-looking duty of guarding the palace doors. Legolas turned from the palace and glanced up once again. It did not seem familiar to him, but, of course, why would it? The dome was placed after Legolas would have left Mirkwood. He would not find any familiarity from it. He was wondering what he should do next when Aerod bumped his shoulder. Legolas turned and smiled at his loyal friend. "Yes, I know," he said as he patted Aerod's nose. "You would like rest. I believe I saw a stable near the entrance." There, indeed, was a stable, and next to the stable was a place set up to find lost kin. Legolas was saddened at the line of elves, wondering if their fathers, sons, daughters, and mothers have been found. After paying for Arod to stay in the stable for a few days, Legolas stood at the stable entrance, watching the line get shorter. He didn't know what made him do it. He obviously wasn't thinking clearly, but he approached the tired elf at the table once the line had died down. "I wish to find someone," he said. The elf barely glanced at him. "Name of the kin you are looking for?" he asked as he gathered his parchment with the list of injured, dead, and missing elves. Legolas hesitated. He shook his head, realizing his foolishness. "I don't know." The elf glanced up at him and gave him a look. "Physical description?" he asked. Legolas could only shake his head again. "I don't know that either," he said in defeat. How was he going to find his family if he didn't know a single thing about them? The elf sighed and pushed his parchment away. "I don't know how you expect me to tell you anything about the elf you are looking for without a name or physical description. I am sorry, but I cannot help you." Legolas was taken aback by the elf's carelessness, but was able to dismiss it. The elf must have been exhausted and going through his own emotional upheaval over the dead, missing, and injured. He almost asked if there were any families missing a son, but stopped before he did. He knew that question would not prove to be helpful. He could imagine that many families were currently missing a son at the moment. Instead, he changed the question to something more relevant to his current situation. "Can you tell me where I might find a place to stay the night? An inn, perhaps? A place to find rest and food?" Legolas asked. The elf almost smiled. "Now that I can tell you. It's not far." Half an hour later, Legolas found himself comfortably situated on the top branch of a cozy little inn, finally able to take off his damp clothing and get some rest. Chapter 13. Captain Aranion rubbed the back of his neck tiredly as he stared out into the forest. He was standing outside the dome with another trusted warrior. His second in command, Thranduil, stood next to him. They ignored the elves behind them, finishing up the dome for the day. "How many remain unaccounted for?" he asked Thranduil. Thranduil sighed, just as weary as Captain Aranion. 23. "I doubt we will ever find their bodies, Captain. The spiders carried several of our warriors into the depths of their webs during the battle." Captain Aranion nodded, already realizing this point. With a heavy heart, he ordered, "Call off the searches, Thranduil. B." He stopped when one of his warriors that was stationed at the palace exited the dome and approached him. The warrior bowed his head in respect. "Captain, Advisor Lolandir wishes to speak to you right away. He says it is very urgent." Captain Aranion nodded and turned back to Thranduil. "Be sure to break the news gently to the kins of the missing warriors. Inform them first of the end of the search." "I will." Captain Aranion nodded and followed the other warrior to the palace. Lolandir was waiting for him in the king's study, pacing the length of the desk with his arms folded behind him. He looked impatient with his eyes narrowed and his quick pacing. He stopped the moment Captain Aranion entered the room. "There you are," he said. Captain Aranion raised an eyebrow. "You wished to speak to me about something urgent?" Lolandir nodded. "I'm sure you heard of the messenger that came today." The captain nodded. "Yes, I assumed it was from the king." Lolandir confirmed his belief with a nod. "Did he find Prince Legolas?" At this, Lolandir sighed and shook his head. Captain Aranion felt his heart sink deep into his chest. "Prince Legolas, it appears," Lolandir said, "left the battle as soon as it was done to come here, to the Greenwood." Captain Aranion's spin straightened immediately. "Here? Prince Legolas is here?" he asked as he walked towards the window and glanced at the kingdom, as if he would immediately spot him. "Could be here," Lolindir corrected. We have no idea if he made it to the Greenwood or not. He stood beside Captain Arinion at the window and glanced down. He could have strayed, or worst. With the battle recovery going on in the past week, he could have easily slipped right past us. He may even be gone already, if he was here at all. Captain Arinion blinked and turned to him. He's here, he said with realization. At least, he was here a few days ago, he added, with a passionate enthusiasm. Lolindir turned to him with questioning eyes. How do you know? He asked. Lenwe. The dead scout? Captain Arinian eyes were bright with hope. Yes, a stranger brought his body home, an elvish stranger. Lolindir's eyes widened with realization. Prince Legolas. Captain Arinion nodded. I shall find him. If he is still here, I will find him. He turned back to the window and made a secret oath to himself. He would find Legolas. He would use whatever it took to find him. He owed it to King Thranduil and Prince Legolas. He had let the chance to stop Legolas from leaving all those years ago. He would not make the same mistake twice. Lolindir couldn't possibly know what was going inside his head and rebutted his attempt to do what he felt was his duty. The advisor shook his head. You are needed to make sure of the protection of our elves, fixing the dome outside the kingdom. I will send. No, Captain Arinian interrupted firmly as he shook his head. I will be the one to look for Prince Legolas. It needs to be me. His mind was already trying to think of possible places to find the missing prince. He would have to check in with the House of Healing first. Maybe one of the healers had noticed something, spoke to him, have an idea where he was heading. Lolindir took a look at his determined face, but tried one last time to feebly convince him to have someone else look for Legolas. It's not your responsibility, he attempted. Captain Arinian held his head up high. Yes, it is, he said firmly, not going to be persuaded. The more we argue, the harder it may be to find him. I'm going. Without giving Lolindir a chance to try and rebut the matter any further, Captain Arinian left the study. The first place Captain Arinian gone to was the House of Healing. It was the only place he knew Legolas had been. It was quiet in the House of Healing for the first time since the battle started. There were only a few elves still in care of the healers. The rest were long buried or had returned to their loved ones. The healer in charge, Healer Erfalaz, had a soft look to him that helped him keep his patients' trust and respect. His babyish face, however, looked weary and worn. His blonde hair had been tied up behind his head hastily. He must not have had any rest since the battle. He glanced up from a patient with tired eyes when Captain Arinian entered the room. I'll be with you in a minute, Captain, he said before turning back to his patient. Captain Arinian nodded and watched patiently as Healer Erfalas reapplied bandages to the wounded arm. There you go, the healer said to his patient. Another day or two, and I shall let you return home. Thank you, healer. The elf grumbled exhaustedly before closing his eyes. Yes, rest now. Healer Erfalas turned away from the patient and walked over to Captain Arinian. What can I help you with, Captain? He asked softly. You remember the elf that brought in Lenwe's body? The healer blinked in surprise of the question. Yes, he said, nodding. What about him? Captain Arinian ignored the question in favor of asking his own. Did you talk to him? Did he tell you where he was going? He asked, trying not to sound as impatient as he felt. The healer shook his head. I didn't talk to him. He was here, and then he left. He just came to drop the body off. Captain Arinian bit back a groan. Can you tell me anything about him? Healer Erfalas narrowed his eyes slightly in confusion. I didn't see much of his physical appearance, but his hair was a slivery blonde color. He was slender. He carried a bow and arrows. I really don't know what you are looking for. Anything to tell me where he might be going?" The healer paused in thought. He shook his head. "I don't know. Wait." He snapped his head up as something came to him, and Captain Irinian felt his heart jump with anticipation. He had a horse with him, a white horse, very loyal. Captain Irinian sighed in relief, knowing what the healer was saying. If Prince Legolas had a horse and he was planning on staying here a few days, it was logical he would need a place to house the animal. He would go to the stables. "Thank you, Healer Airfalas." The stable was, for the most part, empty. Most of the horses were with the king. There were, however, a few horses that was too sick or injured to make the long trek to the Black Gate. He saw, to his misfortune, no unfamiliar horses. It wasn't an overly large stable. It was built like any other structure in the Greenwood, out of trees. Captain Irinian stood at the doorway to the stable and could see every horse that was there. "Captain Irinian," a voice behind him greeted. He turned and saw the stable master, a slender elf with golden blonde hair and light green eyes. He looked young, like any other elf, but his eyes were aged with wisdom, showing his true age. He was much older than Captain Irinian. "Selimor," Captain Irinian greeted back. Selimor narrowed his eyes slightly in question. "It is not often I see the chief captain of the guards here. Is there something I can help you with, my good sir?" Captain Irinian nodded. "I hope so, Selimor." He stepped aside and looked back into the stable. Selimor came to stand next to him. "I had hoped to find a horse I did not recognize." "Oh?" Selimor asked curiously. "I do hope the owner of the horse you are looking for isn't in any sort of trouble." His tone suggested a question. Captain Irinian shook his head. "He's not in any trouble, but I can't tell you anything more. Royal business, I'm afraid." Pause. "You've seen him?" Selimor nodded. A young elf came several days ago to house his loyal companion. However, his horse didn't seem to like the idea of being locked up at night. The elf now lets the horse wander free. "I haven't seen the elf since yesterday." Captain Irinian sighed in disappointment. "Do you have any idea to where I may find him?" Selimor shook his head. "I'm sorry, Captain. I do not know anything. No information for me at all?" Captain Irinian pressed. Selimor stood there in thought for a moment, his eyes wandering around as they wont to do at times. He seemed to have caught something beside the stable, and his eyes lit up. "You may try talking to Rumiel." "Rumiel!" Captain Irinian turned and saw an elf by the information table. He was collecting the papers and putting them in a bag by his side, packing up. Today had been the last day to look for loved ones, since the search had officially ended. Rumiel had several volunteers helping him clean up the area. All of them had solemn expressions on their faces. They, of course, knew all the bodies that laid unclaimed and all those who were never found. It would have been a very trying burden to know. "I saw the elf talking to him several days ago when he arrived," Selimor said. "Thank you, Selimor. I shall talk to him." Captain Irinian left Selimor by the stables and headed over to Rumiel, who was, at that point, putting the last reports into his bag. "Rumiel!" Captain Irinian greeted. The elf glanced up as he tied his bag shut. "Captain Irinian, is there something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice low with his grief. "I do hope so, Rumiel. I am looking for someone. Last I heard of him, he was speaking to you." Rumiel sighed and shook his head. "You will have to forgive me, Captain, but I have had hundreds talking to me the past few weeks. I do not remember all of their faces. You would have spoken to him several days ago. You would not have seen him before. He came with a horse." Silvery blonde hair, slender, had a bow and arrows with him. He traveled alone. Rumil's eyes narrowed in thought, but Captain Aranion was disappointed to see no recognition in his face. The other elf started to shake his head slowly, but stopped, his eyes lighting up with realization. You speak of the elf who wanted to find someone, but couldn't tell me a name or a physical description. Is that right, Captain? Captain Aranion nodded. It may be. Can you tell me anything about him? Where he was going, for instance? As a matter of fact, Captain, he had asked me where he could find some temporary lodging. I pointed him to the direction of the Topiary Inn. The Topiary Inn was a fine and decorative inn. It was the only inn within Mirkwood, and it was never busy. With the state of Mirkwood, they, understandably, didn't get many visitors. The visitors that did come were usually important folk who stayed in a guest room at the palace. There weren't many rooms at the inn, and, more importantly for Captain Aranion, it wasn't far. Captain Aranion nodded his thanks to Rumil before taking his leave. If luck was on his side, Prince Legolas would still be staying there. If the young prince was no longer there, Captain Aranion would not hesitate to leave Mirkwood in search of him. He was not going to let the prince get away this time around. Captain Aranion entered the Topiary Inn and headed straight for the front desk. The she-elf working there widened her eyes in surprise. Captain Aranion! He nodded his greeting, glancing discreetly at her name tag. Afternoon, Nienna. I was wondering about one of your guests that is lodging here. Nienna nodded. We only have one currently staying here, Captain. He did not give me a name, sir. Room? He asked, feeling the warm, hopeful glow in his chest. Could he really be this close to finding the lost prince? He never felt as inspired in his life as he was right then, waiting to see the warrior the young prince surely turned out to be. He wanted the top room, Captain. The she-elf answered. Captain Aranion raised his eyebrows. The very top? She confirmed with a nod, and without him asking, handed him the master key. He sighed and thanked her before heading towards the ladder. He climbed quickly, anxious to get to the top. The Topiary Inn wasn't the tallest tree in Mirkwood, but it was pretty high, giving the occupants on the top branches a prefect bird's-eye view of the kingdom. No wonder Prince Legolas chose the very top room. He would be able to almost see everything at once. Captain Aranion made it to the top, stepping on the wide branch that served as a walkway to the chamber's door. He paused at the door and took a breath. His prince may just be on the other side. It was a heart-stopping moment for him, bringing Legolas home. He raised his hand and knocked, but there was no answer. He knocked again and waited. Nothing. Nienna would have told him if he had checked out. He knocked again, but once again there was no response. Using the master key, he unlocked the door and walked in. The room was bare with only a bed, closet, large open windows, and a chest for storage. He walked, almost in a daze, towards the bed and touched the rumpled brown and green sheets that laid on top, a sign that someone had slept there, that someone could have been Prince Legolas. A bag sat innocently by the bed, and Captain Aranion knelt down to examine it. It was a well-worn bag of brown leather. It was cracked with age and use, but still sturdy and strong. Seeing the bag gave Captain Aranion hope. Prince Legolas would not have left the bag behind. He planned on returning, and Captain Aranion planned to be here when he did. He heard a sound behind him, and he quickly turned, his hand going to his belt where he kept his dagger. An elf stood behind him with his bow nocked with an arrow. He had it aimed at him. The elf's stern blue eyes glared down at him suspiciously as he stepped farther into the room. With his heart pounding, Captain Aranion took his hand away from his dagger and slowly stood. He eyed the figure before him, drinking in the sight of the strong warrior. He gotten so big and strong, he knew who the elf it was. He could see both his parents within him, determined, strong, slight. He would be a mighty king someday, his future king. Who are you? What are you doing in my room? Prince Legolas demanded. I am the chief captain of the king's guards, Captain Irinion, he answered. I'm here for you, Legolas, he said, purposely not calling Legolas by his title. Who, but the king, had the right to inform Legolas of his lineage? Legolas blinked in surprise and slightly lowered his weapon. How do you know who I am? He asked. I haven't told anyone here my name. Captain Irinion smiled at the confirmation that it was Prince Legolas standing before him. We have been waiting for your return for many years. We never stopped looking for you. Legolas lowered his bow to the ground and stepped out of defensive mode. They stared at each other before Legolas quietly asked, Who am I? He titled his head slightly as he considered the captain. Do I know you? He asked. You seem vaguely familiar to me. Captain Irinion nodded. He could feel the burn of tears behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. You knew me once, Legolas. That is true. Oh, Valor, how you have grown, he said in wonder as he glanced up and down at the elf, his prince. Who am I? Legolas asked again. How do I know you? The king will answer all your questions, Legolas. No one else has that right, but you could say I unofficially babysat you several times. Babysitting is not in my job description, but, he said, with a fond smile, I have been known to watch you from time to time. He thought back on all those occasions when little Legolas sought him out, when he was supposed to be in his lessons. Not minding the cute little elfing, Captain Irinion simply let Legolas tag along while he went through his daily routine. Legolas put his arrow away as he processed what Captain Irinion just said. He glanced up at him. The king? What does he have to do with me? Captain Irinion nodded. King Thranduil of the Greenwood realm. He would wish to speak to you about your parents. No one else really has that right. Would you come with me to the palace to await his return? Legolas narrowed his eyes in thought. He blinked in realization. He came to the Black Gate because of me, he stated. Did he know my parents? Captain Irinion paused briefly before nodding slowly. Yes, you could say that. When do you expect him to return? Legolas asked. In a week, no more than 2, Captain Irinion answered as he stepped towards the elf. Legolas was only slightly smaller than him. Legolas flickered his eyes up to him, almost cautiously. The king will answer all of your questions, Legolas. Please come with me. I promise you no one would have need to harm you. My parents were important to King Thranduil, weren't they? Legolas asked. Was my father a member of the guard? The king will answer your questions, Captain Irinion repeated. Legolas glanced down in thought before asking, What of Arod, my loyal steed? Is he still free to wander about the kingdom? Captain Irinion nodded. He is free to wander, but, if you want, you may place him in the royal stables by the palace. Legolas nodded his understanding. If you are willing to come with me, Captain Irinion said, waving a hand towards the door as an offering for Legolas to go, if he wished to. When Legolas didn't make a move to the door, the good captain started to feel desperate. Please, Legolas, he said softly. He glanced away, wondering what he would do if Legolas refused to go to the palace with him. The question was, what could he do? He turned back to Legolas, knowing he would never be able to force him. Legolas was his prince. He couldn't force his prince to do something he really didn't want to do. I will not force you, but I ask you to please come. You have no idea just how important it is for King to see you and speak with you. You will be appreciative as well if you join me at the palace. The answers you seek will be there." Legolas stared back at him. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes showed a hint of frustration. "This is getting wearisome." "Pardon? Everyone who seemed to know who I am will not tell me. It is getting wearisome. That is because they know King Thranduil should be the one to inform you." Legolas took a second to think, and Captain Aranion waited patiently. Finally, Legolas slowly nodded. "I'll go with you, Captain Aranion." Captain Aranion mentally breathed a sigh of relief. Legolas turned to get a full glance of the offered room. He was unsure at first about Captain Arinion's offer. The palace being in the mountain was on the big reason why he hesitated. He was glad to see that, despite it being inside the mountain, it was spacious, with wide-opened windows carved out of the stoned walls. The room he was placed in was the guest room, but it was spacious and warm. It contained a bed, dresser, a fireplace, and a little sitting area next to the fireplace. There was a simple brown and gold rug on the floor, and paintings of trees and landscapes on the wall. The elves had done all they could to make the stone mountain a home for the wood elves. Legolas set his bag down by the bed and glanced at Captain Aranion, who stood just in the doorway watching his reaction. The look on the captain's face made Legolas uncomfortable, not because of any sinister reason, but because the captain seemed genuinely overjoyed to see him. It was a feeling Legolas couldn't completely return, not being able to recognize the elf. He couldn't deny that Captain Aranion seemed familiar to him, but it was like a fading dream. You know you had a good dream, but couldn't remember what it was about. It was almost in reach, but you just couldn't touch it. It was the same feeling he got when he saw King Thranduil during the battle, only not as strong. "Is everything to your liking?" Captain Aranion asked, bringing Legolas out of his thoughts. Legolas around the bed chambers again and nodded. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for your hospitality, Captain Aranion. This is your home, Legolas. There is no need to thank me. If you have need of anything, don't be afraid to ask. It shall be provided for. You are able to go anywhere in the palace. I hope you will be comfortable here." Captain Aranion placed his left fist over his heart and bowed as a sign of respect. "I'll leave you now." He turned and left before Legolas could put a word in. Confused at the captain's sign of respect, Legolas took his quiver off his shoulder and set it down on the bed. He stepped towards the large window and glanced out. Elves were moving about their day, finally getting some normalcy back. It was quiet and peaceful. The trees were welcoming, and the birds were singing. He narrowed his eyes as he continued to think. Home! Captain Aranion called this place his home. Legolas never had a place to call home before, not one he could remember. He still felt like a stranger. After arriving here, he had decided not to let anyone know who he was and what he was doing here. He had wanted time to familiarize with this place, waiting for some recognition to come to him, telling him this was home, this was where he belonged. But now he was here, before he felt completely ready. Before that recognition came to him, he turned back to the bedchamber and glanced around. This did not feel familiar to him. Captain Aranion, though, there was something familiar about him, and the king. The king had sparked some familiarity as well. Speaking of the king, what did King Thranduil have to do with his family? Was his father an honored warrior? Did he once give his life to save the king? And that was why the king wanted to speak to him. He shook his head, knowing he would not know the answer until the king returned. He is here. You found him? Lolandir asked, his eyes growing eager. He sat back, leaning against the king's desk in wonder. Our prince has finally returned home, he said softly. He straightened. I must greet him. I have to see him. He made a move to walk out of the office, but Captain Arinian stopped him with a hand to his chest. Lollandir gave him a confused and frustrated look. "I didn't tell him who he is," Captain Arinian explained as he put his hand down. "Why ever not, Captain? I feel it is for the king to explain. If we tell him he is our prince, he might get overwhelmed and leave before the king could see him. Talk to him. I will not allow that to happen. King Thranduil will see his son," Captain Arinian said passionately. "I will do what I can to keep Prince Legolas here until the king arrives." Lollandir shook his head. "As admirable as that is, Captain, this is not something we can keep contained. Someone will spill. Prince Legolas may find out the truth before the king arrives. What will we tell the servants, the people, those who will have contact with him? He is our prince. They are going to treat him as such. His return will spread throughout the kingdom. He would hear whispers of our prince's return. How can he not connect that with his own arrival?" Captain Arinian sighed. "We will not tell anyone Prince Legolas is here. We will have him go by another name. Orodreth. We shall call him Orodreth. It sounds almost like his grandfather's name, Orifer. The king should be here soon. He will be riding as fast and hard as he dare to reach his son. He would make great haste. Prince Legolas would not go by the name of Orodreth for long." Lollandir nodded, but didn't look confident in Captain Arinian's plan. "Let us hope Prince Legolas doesn't catch on. If we do this right, he will not." Chapter 14. The days passed quickly. Legolas, for reasons unknown to him, was called Orodreth by everyone. He was getting frustrated by the lack of answers to his questions. But Captain Arinian and the chief advisor Lollandir kept their mouths closed. They kept insisting that the king would explain everything. Legolas hoped so, because he was getting very angry at being clueless to his own identity and getting frustrated with all those who knew it but wouldn't tell him. He kept to his bedchambers for most of the day. The looks the servants gave him were uncomfortable. It was like they were trying to place his face or believe they recognized him. They would stare at him as he passed them in the halls or when they deliver his clean clothes and begin whispering the moment they believed he was out of earshot. They usually looked confused or shocked to see him. Their whispers followed him everywhere. If he wasn't in his chambers, he could be found in the archery field. He had oftentimes found solace there, practicing his aim and making more arrows. He grieved the loss of his daggers and his special arrow. Those were the only items left of the time he could no longer remember. That was where he was at when the scout from the king's party entered the realm. Legolas pulled back the string of his bow and aimed at the target far from him. He fired, and the arrow flew to the target, landing close to the middle. He frowned as he walked over to get the arrow. He had to fix the weight, pulled the arrow out, and studied it. "Orodreth, sir?" a soft voice called out to him. He turned and saw a she-elf standing behind him. He recognized her as a servant from the palace, but couldn't place her name. She was one of the ones that oftentimes stared at him. "Yes." "Advisor Lollandir requests your presence in the king's office." He blinked in surprise and nodded. "Thank you." She bowed in respect and walked away, throwing a glance over her shoulder. Legolas gathered up his arrows and returned to the palace. He paused at the office door before reaching up and knocking. He heard Lollandir's voice calling out for him to enter. Inside, Lollandir stood beside a weary-looking elf on the other side of the king's desk. Lollandir looked up when Legolas entered and waved him over. "I thought you would wish to hear this as well." Legolas walked over, but slowed his steps when the other elf eyed him with keen interest. The elf turned to Lollandir. "Is this?" he asked, but stopped when Lollandir nodded. He turned his wide eyes to Legolas and bowed stood with his fist over his heart. "What a fruitful blessing came upon me this day," he stated, as a way of greeting. Legolas eyed the elf in confused. "Thank you, I believe," he said hesitantly as he turned a questioning glance to Lolindir. Catching the look, Lolindir quickly turned the subject. "This is Feanor, a messenger from the king." Legolas perked at the announcement. "I see." He glanced around the room, but didn't see the elf he expected to see. "Shouldn't Captain Arinion be here for this as well?" he asked. "Captain Arinion is inspecting the finished touches on our defenses. I will inform him of Feanor's news as soon as he is done." Lolindir turned back to Feanor. "You were saying, Feanor?" he asked as he sat back down on the king's chair. Legolas took his lead and sat down on the chair across from him. Feanor remained standing. "The king had just entered the forest when I set off ahead to inform you of his arrival. He would be here within the next 2 days," Feanor reported. He glanced at Legolas. "He is most anxious to return and see you, uncomfortable at the attention he was getting." Legolas nodded and turned his gaze to the floor in thought. No one had yet to tell him why the king wished so desperately to talk to him, and he felt himself getting nervous at the quickly approaching meeting. How should he act in front of the king? What should he say? Should he bow with a fist over his heart, like that of his subjects? Should he call him sire, or your majesty, or my lord, or something else entirely? King Thranduil entered the kingdom with stern determination. He did not fail to notice the new branches on the dome or the stench of death still lingering in the air. He knew without question that a battle had taken place in his absence, and his worry for his people reigned in his rush to seek out his son. He was a father, but he also was the king. The welfare of his kingdom concerned him. He must first seek out Captain Arinion and Lolindir concerning the kingdom before questioning them on his son. What would he do if Legolas was not here? He didn't want to know the answer to that question. His people greeted him with joyful faces, lightening his mind on the battle he missed. He nodded to them as he rode by, before turning and giving his weary warriors permission to see their families. After leaving his horse to be stabled by the royal stable elf, he headed towards his palace, where Lolindir and Captain Arinion was waiting for him by the entrance. They both bowed in respect. "Welcome home, my liege," Lolindir said. "You have been sorely missed." Thranduil gave a brief nod in recognition before turning to Captain Arinion. "Are the battle reports on my desk?" he asked. Captain Arinion nodded. "Yes, Hervuin," he answered, not sounding surprised that Thranduil knew of the battle. King Thranduil nodded before heading inside. Captain Arinion and Lolindir followed close behind him. "How long did the battle last?" he asked as he took off his riding gloves. They walked down the well-lit corridor to his office, with passing servants pausing to bow to the king. Thranduil barely acknowledged them, his mind too occupied with the battle he missed, the battle he fought, and his son. The question was on the tip of his tongue. Was he here? But he forced himself to ask only about the battle for now. "It didn't last as long as it could have, Hervuin," Lolindir answered. "We were losing." Captain Arinion jumped in. "We've suffered terrible losses. We would have fallen for sure, Hervuin. But just when the foul enemy was about to swarm into the kingdom, they retreated, swiftly and fast, as if their very being trembled at an unseen foe. We have no explanation as to why." As they approached the office, a servant stepped forward to open the door for them. Thranduil walked in without acknowledging him, but the other two paused a second to give him a thankful nod. They must have felt the fall of their master and grew frightened. "The cowards that they are," Thranduil answered. He walked over to his desk and noticed several reports laying orderly on his desk. He picked one up and read the first few sentences. It was the report on supplies. He placed it back down. Now that he was here and saw the report sitting on his desk, waiting to be read, he quickly jumped to the topic he was most interested in. "Is my son here?" he asked bluntly, no longer able to hold back the burning question. He turned to watch his advisor and his chief captain's expression. They, however, kept their face professional, much to Thranduil's frustration. But did he notice Lolindir's month quirk upward slightly, or was it just a trick of the light? Captain Arinian nodded his head. "I am very pleased to announce that Prince Legolas is indeed in residence." A weight seemed to have lifted off Thranduil's shoulders, so suddenly he felt pulled down to his chair. "He's home," he whispered to himself. He snapped his eyes up to them, narrowed in fierce determination. His light blue eyes were like crystal, shining in cold resolve. "I must see him, now," he ordered. "Hervwine, should you not clean up first?" Lolindir questioned, looking down at Thranduil's worn riding gear that was dirtied from the makeup of the land. Thranduil didn't need to look down at his apparel to know what Lolindir and Captain Arinian saw. Mud spatters, a rip in his trousers, the weary look in his eye, the healing cut on his cheek. "Lolindir, get my son," he said sharply. "I'll clean up while you are retrieving him." He turned to Captain Arinian. "Gather a few guards. I'll be taking Legolas out of the protection of the dome." Captain Arinian brought his fist to his chest and bowed. "I'll go with you myself, my king." Half an hour later, Thranduil was bathed and dressed, waiting for Legolas in his office. Captain Arinian, with several other guards, should already be stationed outside the dome. The moment of meeting his son was fast approaching, and he found it a little hard to stand still, a feat he just barely managed to do. His hands were behind his back, hiding the fact that they were almost shaking in anticipation. He tensed when there was a knock on the door. "Enter," he called out, hoping he succeeded in keeping his voice leveled. The door opened, and he found himself unable to look away, but it was only Lolindir. His advisor bowed. "My king, I apologize for taking so long. He wasn't easy to find." He stepped aside and, for the second time since he ran away, Thranduil saw his son. He immediately saw features of his wife in Legolas, the same slender body, the same nose, and the same chin. There was a delicacy to him that he got more from his mother than Thranduil. He drank in the sight of his son standing there, so close. "Legolas," he breathed out in wonder. The younger elf gave a jerky bow, clearly unsure how to proceed. The action brought Thranduil out of his wonder. He shook his head. "There is no need to act so formal to me, Legolas." He turned to Lolindir, who was watching them curiously. "You may go, Lolindir. If you have need of me, you'll know where I'll be." "Yes, Hervwine," he said with a bow before leaving the room. He left the door open. Legolas stared curiously at Thranduil, titling his head slightly and reminding his father so much of Tauriel. "I was told that you are able to tell me who I am," he said, making it sound almost like a question. Thranduil nodded. "Yes, Legolas. But first," he waved his hand towards the door. "Walk with me. There is someplace I need to show you." Legolas glanced curiously around the spot the king took him. It was some distance from the Dome Kingdom, at an opening of the forest where the river flowed freely. It was a beautiful spot, with trees all around them and bushes of flowers blooming near the riverbank. With the sun out and birds chirping, Legolas couldn't figure out why the place gave him such a feeling of dread and heartache. He frowned as he walked towards the river. King Thranduil stood still behind him, watching him. Captain Arinian and the other guards were out of sight somewhere, giving them privacy. Arod and the king's steed were romping near a rich patch of green grass, a little distance away, blocked from their sight by the ancient trees. Legolas rubbed his chest where his heart ached as he glanced around the area, looking for the answer to his dread, but not finding one. He turned back to the king and was, once again, taken back by the warm look in the older elf's eyes. "What is this place?" Legolas asked him. When he had asked Lolandir how he should address the king, the advisor told him to drop formalities and avoid calling him anything until the answer came to him. Legolas had decided to take his advice despite being uncomfortable with the suggestion. King Thranduil looked away from him to gaze around at the spot. He sighed heavily as he stepped closer to him. Being a king is hard work, especially when you have a family as well. I hadn't spent time with my family for a month, barely saw them. I decided to set a day aside to be with my family. With my wife, we planned the day, time, and place. The king gave a humorless chuckle. Despite my rush to get all the work done before that day, I still ended up being late, but my wife and son forgave me for my tardiness. The king smiled in bittersweet remembrance. Legolas gazed curiously at the king, wondering how this was relevant to him, but not willing to interrupt. The king paused to collect his thoughts. We did not foresee any danger. The orcs at the time barely entered so deeply into the forest, and the spiders have not poisoned the treetops with their deadly webs. I only took 2 guards with us, but attack the orcs did. He pointed towards the edge of the clearing. That was where I found my wife's body. My son was laying so still beside her. "Nana!" A childish voice echoed in Legolas's mind, and his breath started to quicken. He could almost see the attack. Orcs crowding all around. Large, scary beast. A young elfing hiding in the bush, his eyes peeking around the leaves. "Stay hidden," an older female voice, the mother, calling for her son to stay hidden. "I thought I lost them both," King Thranduil continued to say, not knowing the effect it was having on Legolas. "But my son, my brave little greenleaf." Legolas blinked at the slightly familiar nickname, but he couldn't figure out why it sounded so familiar. He lifted his head. The king continued to say, "I cannot describe how I felt right then. Relief, gladness, sorrow, but the strongest emotion was guilt." "Guilt?" Legolas questioned. King Thranduil nodded. "I blamed myself for not being prepared for an attack, only taking 2 guards, both who lost their lives that day. Was one of them his father?" Legolas wondered. Was that why the king was telling him this? For making my son motherless, for going out that day. My shame led me to push my son away. He gave Legolas a sorrowful look. Legolas shifted his feet uncomfortably, not knowing why the king was giving him such a significant look. The king finally looked away, facing the river with his arms behind his back. He looked strong to Legolas, an immovable leader who had seen much in his life. "I heard you lost your son. I am sorry to hear that," Legolas said softly, feeling the need to say something before the silence stretched too far. "Did you?" the king said, not sounding too surprised. He turned back to Legolas. "What did you hear of him?" he questioned curiously. Legolas shook his head. "I did not hear much about him, just that he died." He made the sentence sound like a question, for it never was too clear what happened, and it wasn't a tale he took into account. King Thranduil chuckled softly. "You grew up among men. I had almost forgotten. Amusing thing about men, stories change from father to son constantly. They romanticize tales more and more as it is passed down from generation, twisting it and changing it as they see fit, not even realizing they are doing it." He shook his head. "No, my son did not die. He is very much alive. His living breath causes my heart to swell with pride for how he turned out, a strong and noble warrior. There was an inkling in the back of Legolas's mind that started to grow, much to his horror as the king continued to talk about his son. "What did happen to your son?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. He took an unwitting step away from the king. King Thranduil just watched him, an intense look in his eye. I pushed him away too far. During a time where he needed me the most, I pushed him away, and he left home, ran away from home and me. For 2,000 years, I've looked for him. He never knew just how much I looked. He dodged those sent to find him without realizing it, time and time again, until I got a letter from the late Marchwarden of Lothlorien, informing me he saw my son. Legolas felt his suspicion grow, and he took another step back. He looked away from the king and started shaking his head in denial. Lord Elrond had sent a letter informing me of a battle that will and did take place at the Black Gate, King Thranduil continued to say. With the knowledge my son traveled with Lord Aragorn, I had to go get my son. Legolas' eyes widened, and he took another step back. However, he didn't wait for me. He left before I could talk to him. There was a pause as the king drifted away in some memory. "My wife named our son," he said quietly. Legolas' breath came out heavy as his heart pounded in his chest. "Well, what did she name him?" he asked. This time he was afraid of the answer. King Thranduil gave him such an intense look that there was no denying what he was going to say next. "Legolas? She named him Legolas, but I had called him my little Greenleaf." He took a step forward, but Legolas found himself backing away and shaking his head in denial. Powerful emotions seized him, so sudden, too much, too unexpected. His father in front of him. No, this wasn't what he wanted. His father, the very important figure for the kingdom, the king, that would make Legolas the prince, and no, he couldn't. His brain shut down too, muddled to make a clear thought. He reacted on instinct. He turned and ran. "Legolas!" the king shouted after him, but he paid him no mind as he jumped on a rod and rode away. Thranduil stared and shook as his son ran away from him for the second time. He found his feet frozen to the ground, unable to move no matter how much he tried to get them to run after Legolas. He took a shaking breath as he felt his heart ache in his chest. He felt so numb. He didn't think he could live without his son. Captain Arinion rushed towards him from where he was hiding the trees. He looked concerned. "Hervoin, what happened? Is everything well? Are you well?" Thranduil still couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that Legolas ran from him again. He shook his head as he stared blankly at the direction Legolas had rushed off to. He ran. "He's leaving again," he said numbly. Captain Arinion eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat before his eyes narrowed in determination. "Not this time, my king." He turned towards the forest. "Take the king back to the palace. Make sure he gets rest. I'll return soon." As he saw the 5 guards they had brought with them emerge from the trees, Captain Arinion took off in the direction Legolas ran off to. He had to catch up to him before Legolas got too far. He jumped on his horse and galloped quickly, trees passing like a blurry dream, jumping over roots, ducking under branches. It almost felt like flying as he raced to catch up to his prince. He couldn't let Legolas just go, like last time. He had to do all he could to make sure Legolas stayed. He had to make it up to the king for what happened 2,000 years ago. He had to catch up to Legolas. He sped the horse up when he thought he saw Legolas up ahead. Legolas was racing his horse as well, seemingly trying to get out of Mirkwood as fast as he could. But the farther away he got from the palace, the slower he went, as if he exhausted himself and Captain Arinian was able to catch up to him. "Prince Legolas, stop!" he yelled. "Please." To his surprise and relief, Legolas pulled his horse to a stop and looked back at him as Captain Arinian slowed his horse to a stop beside him. Legolas shook his he-head. "Do not call me," he ordered a little harshly. "Legolas, do not go," he pleaded, dropping the royal title. "I can't let you go." Legolas's eyes hardened. "You can't let me go. Am I to be a prisoner here? Forced to stay locked away in the mountain palace, never to taste the sweetness of freedom? What shall you do, Captain? Bound me in rope and drag me back?" He shook his head. "I think not. If this is what Mirkwood is about, then don't expect me to come back." "Come back?" Captain Arinian echoed with question. "Will you?" Legolas blinked. "Pardon?" he asked. "Will you come back, Legolas? You are right. I have not the will to drag you back like some runaway elfing. You are a full-grown elf, an independent warrior. Besides, I cannot force you to do anything you do not wish to do." He took a breath. "However, your father needs you. Knowing you were alive was the only thing that kept him from fading all these years. He wants to be a part of your life," he said. "If you do go, will you come back?" Legolas looked away, scanning the dark, ominous trees as he thought. Captain Arinian waited patiently to be acknowledged again. Finally, Legolas turned back to him. "I cannot promise anything, but I may return someday. I just can't go back now. Not now. I need time. I need to think." Captain Arinian nodded, knowing that was the best Legolas could give him without lying. "I'll inform your father." He urged the horse backwards in silent invitation for his prince to leave. Legolas returned the nod in a grateful gesture before petting the neck of his horse. "Rod, let's ride." Then he was off. Captain Arinian didn't move, just watched as his prince was swallowed up by the trees. He sighed, the guilt growing in his heart. He couldn't force the prince to stay. He knew that before, but he wished Legolas would have. This was worse than last time. Last time he had no knowledge until after the fact. This time, he literally let Legolas go. What would the king think of him? Chapter 15. "You did the right thing, Captain. Do not cast blame on yourself," King Thranduil said, after Captain Arinian told him what happened in the forest. Captain Arinian was standing before the king in the throne room with his head bowed. He had expected the king not to be too happy with him. He expected a demotion or some other form of punishment. He snapped his head up at the king's statement. The king was sitting on the throne, looking tall and proud. He did not look like the same elf that was standing there motionless in the forest an hour ago. He was back to being the king, but Captain Arinian knew the king a little too well. He could see the dimness in the king's eye, the tightened jaw. He could tell how hard the king tried to control his emotions. "But, my king, I let him go." King Thranduil nodded. "That was the right thing to do, Captain. I would want my son here willing, not by force. You've done enough. You gave me hope. Hervuin, you brought word that Legolas may return. That is all one could hope for. I am grateful to you, Captain. You are dismissed." His voice even sounded more saddened, more monotone, like he was going through the motions. Captain Arinian placed a fist over his heart and bowed before backing out of the room. Just before the door closed, he looked back and saw the king slumped in his seat, his hand rubbing his face wearily and staring at his other hand that held a faintly familiar dagger. Captain Arinian felt a flicker of concern, but the door closed, and he was left staring at the painted white wooden surface. He sighed, knowing there was nothing he could do to bring comfort for the king. The only one who could was already some distance away from the domed kingdom. Legolas traveled hard towards Gondor. The only place he knew he had friends, and the place that housed the only person he could talk to about this sudden revelation. It took 3 weeks to get there, despite Legolas' hard travel. Several times, he came across an angry and frightened band of orcs. After that gruesome fight, he felt significant relief to seeing the white structure of Minas Tirith glittering in the bright sun of noonday. With his sharp elfish eyes, he could see the men working on repairing the damaged walls. They were close to completion. He urged his tired horse forward at a much slower pace. Now that Minas Tirith was in sight, they let him enter the city without question, recognizing him right away. He made his way up to the top of the city. After stabling Arod and thanking him for the safe and quick journey, Legolas headed for the throne room, hoping to find Aragorn nearby. Aragorn appeared from one of the side doors, just as Legolas entered. The man was clearly happy to see him by the warm smile that crossed his face. He was dressed more cleanly than Legolas ever saw him. He was wearing the white tree on his chest, which symbolized Gondor. His hair had been trimmed and combed back. "Legolas, I hope all is well. I did not expect to see you so soon." Legolas felt some of his tension to leak away by the warm welcome. "Aragorn," he greeted, "I do hope your offer of home here is still valid." The man's smile slowly vanished. "You had no luck in Mirkwood?" he asked, confused. Legolas had no doubt the man knew. The king of Mirkwood would have surely spoken to Aragorn before heading back to his homeland. It was. He paused and glanced down, unsure exactly what to say. Aragorn's face grew sympathetic. "Why don't we have this conversation in a more private and less formal setting?" Legolas gave him a grateful smile. Aragorn led Legolas outside. They didn't talk until they were past the white tree and the court of the fountain and walking along the battlement. "What is wrong, Legolas?" Legolas took a moment to gather his thoughts before answering with another question. "How did you take the revelation of your heritage?" Aragorn nodded in understanding and stopped walking. Legolas stopped beside him and waited for the answer. "I ran away," Aragorn acknowledged. Legolas glanced out into the horizon, realizing he had done the same thing. "Did you return?" he asked. "Yes," Aragorn answered bluntly. "It took several years, but I returned to Rivendell and made peace with the elf I called Ada for my whole life. It took much longer to accept being the king of men. I am still trying to accept it, but it is a part of me. I cannot ignore my birthright, not anymore." "Did you have no choice? No freedom?" The elf couldn't help but ask. "I would not say I have no freedom in being a king, just a different set of rules and more dependence under my care." He gave Legolas a look. "Do not fear, as I did. For the seat of royalty, Legolas. Do not wait years, as I did, to return." Legolas found himself unable to respond. "You have someone I did not have," Aragorn continued to say. "You have your father to help. He loves you, Legolas, and he missed you. You have longed for family and home for so long. Do not let your fear and insecurities of being royal keep you from what you have wanted for so long. You may not have remembered, but it has been a part of you for your whole life. You just found out what it is, what has been missing." He placed a hand on Legolas's shoulder. "You are allowed to choose your own path. Until you choose, you are free to stay here." "Lehanan," Legolas said softly. Aragorn stared at him, studying his tense body. "Finding out you will someday sit on a throne is not the only reason you left, was it, my good friend?" Legolas glanced at him before turning to gaze in the direction of Mirkwood and shook his head as he turned back to him. "How perceptive," he whispered almost to himself. "I was taken aback and reacted. I do not believe I was as ready to suddenly meet him. An elf I thought fated long ago. I wasn't expecting it. I had thought the king was to inform me of the death of my parents, to find differently, as well as finding out I am of royal blood. He shook his head again and glanced down. I just reacted. I ran. Aragorn nodded slowly in thought. Time is all you need, Legolas. It will help you wrap your mind around it all. Your father will be there, ready to greet you with open arms when you return, whether it takes several months or several years. Just give yourself time. You ignorant lad. Legolas chuckled and turned to the source of the voice. Gimli, he greeted the dwarf walking towards him. It had been several hours since he talked to Aragorn. During that time, he mostly stayed in the guest chambers Aragorn gave him and thought over the future king's words. Gimli had cornered him the moment he stepped out of his chambers. Legolas closed his bedchambers before turning back to the approaching dwarf. What have I done to earn your ire? He asked with a fond smile. Gimli stood in front of him and folded his arms. Let's just hope you don't end up like your father. The smile left Legolas's face, and he almost flinched. May we not talk about that? He asked with a frown. Fine by me, I say. Gimli agreed. What really annoyed me is you not saying goodbye to the hobbits. Since you've left, they've been on my tail, trying to figure out why you left without a goodbye to them. It is quite annoying, he grumbled. Legolas chuckled. I apologize, and I must do the same to the hobbits. Had I not felt hurried, I would have taken the time for a proper farewell. I do hope they would understand. He stopped when he saw Gimli eyeing him. Legolas tilted his head to the side. What is it, my friend? Gimli shook his head. I don't see the resemblance. You are much more tolerable than that king. Legolas sighed. I thought we weren't going to talk about it. Gimli shrugged. You asked, I answered. Let's go. Supper is ready, and I am starving. He turned and started down the corridor. Legolas followed beside him. How is your other hobbit friend? Frodo, I believe his name is. Awake and moving about, Gimli said. You can finally meet him at dinner. He is quieter than he used to be. Well, he has always been a quiet hobbit, but it is different this time. He has felt the weight of evil. It changes men, elves, dwarves, and, apparently, hobbits. Wise words for a dwarf, Legolas said, smirking silently at the mock annoyance on Gimli's face. I am glad to hear of your friend's swift recovery. I cannot wait to finally meet him. He sounds like a very, very brave and strong hobbit. Aye, Gimli agreed. That he is. That he is. All those hobbits are brave. Legolas chuckled and nodded. Yes, I do agree. By this point, they had reached the doors to the dining hall. Legolas stepped forward and opened the door for Gimli before following in behind him. The dining hall was a private hall for the royal family and close special guests. It was smaller than the main dining hall, used during elaborate parties. Aragorn was there, as well as Gandalf and 4 small hobbits. Aragorn was sitting at the end of the table with Gandalf on his right. The 4 hobbits were seated on the left side of the table. 2 of the hobbits, Merry and Pippin, stood up when Gimli and Legolas entered. Legolas! They shouted in greeting before turning to their 2 other companions. Frodo, Sam, this is the elf we were talking about. This is Legolas. Merry, introduced as Legolas, found a seat beside Gandalf, facing a blonde-haired hobbit, a sincere young one with kind brown eyes. Legolas nodded his head towards the hobbit in greeting as Gimli sat beside him. Pleasure to meet you, and which are you, Frodo or Sam? He asked. The blonde-haired hobbit sat straight in attention at the direct question. Oh, Master Elf, I am Samwise Gamgee. This," he turned to a dark-haired hobbit beside him, "is Frodo Baggins." Legolas turned his attention to the solemn, dark-haired hobbit with old, experienced eyes. "It is pleasing to see you are well, young ring-bearer. Your friends were most concerned for your safety." The hobbit, Frodo, flickered his eyes up to him and gave him a smile. Legolas couldn't help but think how strained the smile looked. Frodo had carried the dark object for months. It would tint his soul for the rest of his life. He would no longer be the innocent, carefree hobbit he must have been before the ring fell into his person. "Thank you," he responded quietly. By the shared looks between Aragorn and Gandalf, Legolas knew they caught what Legolas had seen. An old soul in one so young, an unhealable wound forever etched into his person. Legolas silently grieved the loss of that innocence. The rest of supper went by smoothly, Merry and Pippin being the center of amusement. They had, of course, scowled Legolas for leaving without giving them a farewell, in which Legolas wholeheartedly apologized for. It didn't take long for them to forgive him. It was during the supper that Legolas got news of all he had missed. All of Rohan had returned home. However, they were already expecting another visit from Lady Eowyn, who seemed to have been pierced by love for Faramir. As for Aragorn's coronation, that would be in a year, giving the people time to rebuild and for word to be sent out and responded to. The hobbits were, as always, an amusement to all at the table. The bickering of Merry and Pippin had Gimli laughing too hard to take a sip of his ale, causing much amusement for Legolas. He backed silently out of the conversation as the table started reminiscing on things that happened long before he joined the group. By listening, he was able to learn about Gandalf's fireworks, Sam's garden, Bilbo Baggins' birthday party, and all about the Took family. It caused Legolas to long for the experience of family. He frowned as the thought of returning to Mirkwood soon crossed his mind. He had the chance to experience family. If only he could be brave enough to go for it. It had been 2 months since Legolas had left Mirkwood, and he felt it was time to return. Hearing all the talk about their families, Legolas felt the urge to return to Mirkwood more and more. He couldn't blame the others for talking almost non-stop about those they miss and love. Even Gimli talked of his father often. A month before Legolas left Gondor, Gimli had taken his leave. He felt that he needed to inform his father, personally, of Balin's death in Moria. He would return for the coronation, of course. The hobbits had left several weeks before Gimli, leaving Legolas alone with only Aragorn and Gandalf as company. It was then that he decided he should try to get to know the one family member he had left. Legolas climbed onto Arod's back and petted his mane. "Are you about ready, my friend?" he whispered in Elvish to his horse. Arod gave out a snort and bobbed his head as he stomped his hooves on the stone ground, excited to get going. Legolas chuckled. "You are more eager than I." Aragorn entered the stable and came up to his side. "Are you sure you don't want me to send word ahead, Legolas? They will not be expecting you." Legolas nodded. "I am sure," he answered more confidently than he felt. "I'll return before your coronation." "I promise, my friend," Aragorn smiled. "I'll hold you to that promise. I hope you find what you desire most. Safe journey. Galu." "Good luck. Goodbyes." After the goodbyes were said, Legolas was off once again. It took over a month for Legolas to make it to Mirkwood Forest. He had Arod move more and more slowly as they got closer to the forest. His nerves began to grow stronger at each step. He wondered how he would be received, how to greet the king. He was unable to sleep as he worried over the inevitable meeting. When they reached the edge of Mirkwood Forest, Legolas stopped Arod and stared into the shadows of the trees. The months he had been gone made a difference to the forest. He could sense life where before there was only suffering. The darkness of the forest was slowly leaving. The elves in the trees were fighting back to reclaim their forest. He slid off the back of Arod as he stared at the trees. "I do not know if I am ready for this, Arod," he whispered. Arod nudged his shoulder in encouragement. Legolas smiled and petted his nose. "Thank you, Arod, for being here with me. I know you are tired, as am I," he sighed. "But let us continue." He led Arod into the forest. It was almost nightfall of the 5th day since he entered the forest by the time he came across the kingdom. Legolas paused behind a tree and stared at the guarded entrance. 2 guards were standing on either side of the wooden gate, alert and ready for an attack. Years under the threat of darkness had prepared them to always expect an attack. They were not going to slack now, despite the Dark Lord's fall. Arod nudged his shoulder, and Legolas reached up to pat his nose. "I am not sure I am ready for this after all, Arod," he said once again, still staring at the entrance. "What if he was angered that I left so suddenly, that I ran from him? What if he doesn't like the elf I became? How would the people respond to me? Would they want a prince who knew nothing of the politics of elves, much less the politics of Mirkwood? I know nothing of the inhabitants of Mirkwood. The days I spent there were not enough time to learn about them." Arod nudged his shoulder again and gave out a snort. Legolas smiled slightly. "Yes, perhaps I should take a chance to know the elves of Mirkwood before going to Palace. You are a smart horse, Arod." He blinked back his tiredness as he moved towards the dome's guarded entrance. It wasn't hard getting past the guards. They seemed to naturally trust another elf and let him through without question. Legolas was surprised, for he expected half their job was to look out for him. Mirkwood hadn't changed in the few months he had been away, except the elves were happier in their daily lives. The battle was already far behind them, and they had moved on with their lives. There was a song in the air, sung by a joyful she-elf somewhere. The birds chirped along with her song, and the wind whistled through the leaves of the trees. It was all a song, a beautifully sung melody, harmonious and sweet. There was a soft chatter of talking elves, bartering or speaking as close friends. Legolas couldn't hold back the smile on his face at the feeling of peace in the air, peace that wasn't there the first time he was in the kingdom. Legolas walked among the elves, and not one seemed to suspect his lineage. Arod wandered away from him, but Legolas was not worried for him. Arod had walked around Mirkwood longer than Legolas. He surely had a spot he liked. Alone, Legolas walked along the forest floor where the market seemed to thrive. He paused to talk to some elves at the market, getting to know them, and the elves didn't seem to know who they were talking to. The elves seemed friendlier, now that the darkness was slowly fading away. They didn't seem as guarded as they were the last time he was here. He met an elf whose hobby was making beautiful necklaces that he sold at his own booth in the market. An elf who was old enough to remember the time before the darkness touched the forest. A she-elf in her first woes of love, and a she-elf glowing with love. Legolas became fascinated by their stories and tales. He got more comfortable around them. He laughed with them and told tales of his own, nothing to reveal who he was, but things of his travels. It was dark by the time Legolas turned his attention to the palace, feeling extremely weary. The lack of sleep the past few nights had him almost dropping to his knees. He was in no condition to visit the king. He stared at the mountain palace, unsure what he should do. He didn't want to spend money on the inn. The she-elf working there might recognize him. He couldn't just walk in without someone informing the king, and Legolas was not at all ready for that meeting to take place now. It would just be another emotional toll on his already weary body. He eyed the rocky interior and the open windows and sighed. He knew what he had to do. He would have to sneak in and rest in an empty bedchamber. This was, after all, a palace. There should be plenty of empty bedchambers reserved for guests, and this was apparently his home. He would not be intruding. At least, he hoped they would not see it as him intruding. It shouldn't be that hard to climb to a window. The rocky interior was made with stone, and the stone wasn't smooth by any means. Determined, Legolas stepped forward, dodging past the guards at the entrance with ease, and began to climb carefully up the wall, hoping the night would shade him from passing eyes. The first window he came to was no good. He could hear the shifting of some sleeping body in the room, and the next window did not lead into a bedchamber. Same with the next window. However, the next darkened window was still, so very quiet. It wasn't too far from the ground, but it wasn't too close either. With tired arms, Legolas dragged himself into the bedchamber silently, then waited, hearing for any noise he may not have caught the first time. But all was silent. He waited for his eyes to adjust to the darkness with the help of the faint light from the few dimly lit lanterns outside. To his relief, he saw an outline of a bed, an empty bed close to the window. The room had a faint feeling of abandonment, as if no one had been in the room for quite some time, but there was the smell of fresh, clean. If he had to guess, he would have said they kept the room clean for any unsuspecting visitor that may show up, but there hadn't been one for quite a while. Glad at this assumption, Legolas took off his bow and quiver and laid them down on a chair by the bed. He set his traveling bag down next to the chair. He was too tired to do much else. With relief, Legolas laid on the bed, and his eyes quickly gazed into a peaceful slumber. He never even pulled the covers over himself. Groggily, Legolas's eyes tried focusing, but he was too tired. Someone was beside him, sitting at the edge of the bed. Legolas could feel their weight by his side and the body heat. He groaned and shifted, trying to wake, but the person laid a hand on his shoulder to still him. "Hush, Legolas," a male elf said softly from above him. Legolas settled back down, too tired to argue, and he didn't sense any danger. His eyes started to gaze over in sleep again, but there was something tugging beneath him. He groaned and moved. The thing left, and his body settled back on the bed. Something soft and warm fell across him, and he snuggled deep into the warmth. Something touched his temple and brushed back his hair. Legolas groaned again and stirred. "Sleep, Ion Nin. Sleep. You're safe. You're home," the voice said quietly. "You're home, my son." Legolas fell back asleep, feeling the protective eyes watching over him. Chapter 16. Legolas woke feeling refreshed and rested. His eyes gazed back into focus very slowly before sitting up. The blanket fell to his stomach as he did so, and he gazed at it. He did not remember getting under the covers, but he had been very tired last night. He lifted his eyes from the bed to take a look around the room. It was a simple room, large and spacious. It was a child's room. The walls were covered in childish paintings of an elven family. There was a large dresser where a small elven could easily hid in, standing majestically against the wall. By the window, a fireplace was in the wall across from the bed, and a colorful rug on the floor. He could see the small, opened chest of toys on the other side of the dresser. Legolas got out of bed. The stone floor was cold. Cold? He glanced down at his bare feet. He didn't remember taking his boots off, either. He really must have been more exhausted than he originally thought. He glanced around and located his boots by the foot of the bed. He slipped his boots back on, grateful not to feel the cold stone. His weapons and travel bag were still by the chair next to the bed. He grabbed everything and was ready to sneak out of the room when there was a knock on the door. He froze. The knock came again before the door creaked opened. Legolas's heart pounded nervously in his chest as a she-elf entered the room, holding fresh sheets in her arms. She gasped in surprise when she saw him. "Oh," she bent gracefully down into a curtsy. "My apologies, Hervuin. I thought you still abed." Legolas blinked. "Pardon?" he asked. The she-elf acted like she knew he was here, but how? He snuck in late last night, and no one was expecting him. The she-elf kept her head down in a submissive manner. "You did not answer, Hervuin. I assumed you were still abed. I was just going to set these." She indicated to the clean sheets in her hand. "Down, Hervuin," Legolas murmured in confusion. "The servant whore is waiting for you out in the corridor, Hervuin. He will show you to the king's private dining hall." He was very confused, but decided to try and figure out what was going on by stepping around the she-elf and towards the door. "Hervuin," she called out. He turned. "You may leave your things here. They will be safe here." Legolas hesitated, but he mentally checked to see if a dagger was still hidden in his tunic before setting his pack and his weapons down by the door. He left the room. There was an elf leaning against the wall by the door, but he quickly stood in attention when Legolas stepped out. "Hervuin," he greeted. "I'm here to lead you to the dining hall. If you would follow me." Cautiously, Legolas did. King Thranduil was already in the dining hall when Captain Irinian entered. He sat at the end of the long table and gracefully nodded for the captain to sit on his left. Captain Irinian sat down and placed his reports on the table next to his plate. "Thank you, Hervuin." He glanced casually to the king's right and saw another plate set up. "I was not aware Lolindir will be joining us. I believed him busy this morning." King Thranduil nodded. "You will be correct, Captain." He took a bite out of his breakfast. Captain Irinian gave the empty space a confused look. He leaned back when a servant brought him his food. He waited for the servant to get out of sight before continuing the conversation. "Who are we expecting, Hervuin? If you don't mind me asking," he asked as he picked up his fork to begin eating. As if on cue, the door opened, and Captain Irinian almost dropped his fork in shock. Prince Legolas stood in the doorway, looking nervous and out of place. He shifted his feet, and his eyes flickered around. His body was so tense. He wore simple traveling clothes that was wrinkled and stained with dirt, supposedly from his travel here. Captain Irinian felt the king sit up straighter at the sight of his son. "Legolas, why don't you sit down and eat?" the king said calmly. But Captain Irinian heard the faint inflection of his voice, revealing to him of his own nervousness. Legolas hesitated, glancing around quickly, as if looking for an escape route, but he eventually dragged his feet over and slowly took the chair on the right of the king. There was an awkward silence as the servant brought him his food. Captain Irinian couldn't help but stare, wondering when Legolas came back to the Mirkwood and why he wasn't told before. "Captain, the morning report?" King Thranduil said calmly as he turned his attention to him. Captain Irinian blinked as he slowly pulled himself from his thoughts. "Pardon, Hervuin." The king gave him a look. "The report?" he said firmly, eyeing him as if trying to send a message. Yes, the reports," Captain Irinian said, catching on. The king was trying to make Legolas feel more comfortable by not giving him a lot of attention right away. Captain Irinian flipped open the reports and handed them to the king. "Captain Findicano wants to return to his post. The healers said he has made a full recovery. I am hesitant to have him return straight back to his post, however." King Thranduil nodded in agreement as he skimmed over the report. I agree, Captain. He's been out since the battle. I am not comfortable with him taking his leadership post so soon after recovery. What are you going to do about it, Captain? I'm going to work with him, Hervuin, check his skills and refine them when needed. Until then, he will not go on duty. King Thranduil nodded his approval. See that he doesn't, Captain Irinian. Captain Irinian went through the rest of the reports in between the bites of food. The few side glances he gave Legolas revealed the younger elf barely eating. He was obviously still uncomfortable and unsure what he should do. He fiddled with his fork. His eyes mostly stayed on his plate, only flickering towards him or the king every minute or two. His back was straight and his body tense. He looked ready to leap at the first sign of trouble. Knowing it was wise to let the two newly united family members alone, Captain Irinian took his leave right after the reports was done. He hoped desperately that they would be able to clear the awkward air between them and that Legolas would stay. How did you sleep, Legolas? The sudden question took Legolas by surprise, and it took a moment to form an answer. Restfully, he answered quietly, keeping his eyes on his food and moving his fork around the plate to hide the shaking of his hand. His heart was still pounding wildly in his chest. He was uncertain how to act around the elf that he had once called father. He could feel the king's gaze on him, but still didn't glance up. There was a moment of awkward silence. Are you finished? The king finally spoke, setting his own fork down and pushing his plate slightly away. Legolas's eyes flickered up to him without thinking. Pardon? He asked in surprise. The king nodded towards his plate. Your breakfast. Are you finished? He asked again. Oh, Legolas glanced down at his barely eaten plate and nodded cautiously. Yes, sir. Good. The king stood up, and Legolas hesitantly followed his example. I want to show you something, if you will follow me. The last time the king said he wanted to show him something, he took him to the place where his mother died, and it was there that he realized just who his father was. It made him hesitant to follow the king again. But what choice did he have? And wasn't he just a little curious what the king wanted to show him? As if reading his mind, the king stated, We aren't leaving the palace this time. Come, Legolas, if you will. Legolas nodded and followed the king out of the private dining hall. They walked in silence down the corridor. The king looked unconcerned and calm, much too calm. Legolas, on the other hand, had his heart pounding wildly in his chest. His hands felt a little shaky, and he was having trouble looking away from the elf walking in front of him, his father. His mind was still having trouble processing that he was walking behind his father. The king stopped at a pair of double doors. A servant reached out to open it, but the king waved him away. The servant bowed and stepped back. Once the elf was far enough away, the king reached for the handle and opened one of the double doors, stepping aside to allow Legolas entrance first. Legolas glanced at the king's face, but the king didn't seem to be willing to show any emotion that might sway Legolas's decision. The king watched him, waiting with patient blue eyes Legolas had seen in his own reflection. He took a step into the darkened room, but didn't dare go too far. From what he could see so far, it appeared to be some sort of parlor room. He could see the outline of a few cushioned chairs and what looked to be a fireplace. He heard the king step in behind him and closed the door, leaving them in darkness. Legolas waited, tensed with his uncertainty. The king stepped around Legolas, and he could hear the king's footsteps fade to the far end of the room. Suddenly, there was light as the king opened a few curtained windows. Legolas glanced once again around the room. He was right. in his first assessment. It was a parlor, a well-decorated parlor with rich color of red and browns and extravagant paintings of past elves and landscapes on the walls. A few of the walls had bookshelves filled with books and scrolls, and a fireplace with red cushioned armchairs sitting in front of it. One of the paintings by the fireplace was a large portrait of a small family, the king's family, which meant Legolas's family. Legolas couldn't help but step closer to the portrait. The she-elf was sitting on a chair with a little elfling on her arms. Standing behind her was the king with his arms on her shoulders. He looked stern, but there was some glint in his eyes that told Legolas it was just for show. He turned his attention back to the she-elf. She was beautiful. She had sparkling green eyes. Her silvery blonde hair was in a braid and over her shoulder. She was almost smiling, as if she couldn't keep a straight face, like that of her husband. Her head was leaned back against her husband's chest, showing their close relationship by the comfort she took from being with him. Baby Legolas was smiling at him with gleeful eyes. He looked so young and innocent. He was opened to his emotions, like most children at that age. They looked like they were a very happy family. He reached up and touched the she-elf's face, trying to remember her face, but all he got was an unwelcome vision of her screaming. He flinched and quickly took his hand off the portrait. He felt a presence by his side. He shook his head and said quietly, "I cannot remember her. She would have been proud of how you turned out, as I am." Legolas snapped his head towards the king and stared at him, but the other elf was keeping his eyes on the portrait. Legolas turned back to the portrait. He was proud of him. Legolas felt something inside him, a warmth he was unfamiliar with. "How did you know I was here?" he asked. When the king didn't answer right away, Legolas turned to him. The king was staring back at him with an intense look. He answered right after their eyes met. "I go there when I can't sleep, when nightmares of that day come back to me. I heard you moving in your sleep. I came in, and you were there." Legolas shifted his feet uncomfortably at the warm feelings inside him. "Why there?" he asked, trying to keep focus on the conversation. It was hard to talk around the lump in his throat. "That was your bedchamber. I had to tuck you in more than once." The king smiled at some fond memory. "You like to stay up playing with your toys on your bed. I found you sleeping on top of your covers with your toys spread across your bed quite often." Legolas looked away and frowned. "I can't remember any of it." "You wouldn't, Legolas. You were much too young to remember. All you need to know is that you are home." Legolas glanced back at him. The lump in his throat seemed bigger, and he could feel something burning in the back of his eyelids, tears that were threatening to fall. "Home," he whispered as he glanced away from him to look around the parlor. "I never had a home. You did, and you do, right here." Legolas turned back to him, unable to speak. There must have been something encouraging in his eyes, for the king suddenly had his arms around him. Legolas tensed at the unexpected feeling of strong, firm arms wrapped around him, but he felt such warmth and care from the embrace that he couldn't help but relax a moment later. He leaned his head to the crook of the king's neck, and the king tightened his arms around him and began murmuring to him, "I have wanted this for so long, just to have you, my son, in my arms once again. It's been so long." Tears slipped from Legolas's eyes as he finally realized that, yes, this was home. He was finally home. "Home," he whispered. "I'm home." A feeling settled over him. For the first time since he came here, he finally felt something familiar, and that was the embrace of the king, his father. It suddenly seemed so familiar to him. It was home. Mirkwood wasn't home. Thranduil King was his home. It was the one piece of Mirkwood that seemed familiar to him, like a dream he was trying to remember. He belonged there. He felt the king nod above him. "Yes, son, you are home. You're home," he whispered back. A few days later, found Thranduil staring out the window of his office. He never felt so content since the day his wife was killed. Legolas, his son, had finally returned to him. He had prayed for this day for so long. He could barely believe it was finally here. The sound of laughter brought his attention to the forest floor. Legolas laughing as his horse nibbled affectionately at his neck, tickling him. Thranduil's heart seemed to expand with love for his son. He never thought he would hear the sound of his laughter ever again. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He watched as Legolas hugged his horse and petted him. He showed utter devotion to his steed. Thranduil couldn't help but be truly proud of how his son turned out. He was such a loyal, strong, and affectionate warrior. There was something about him that still seemed innocent to Thranduil. Despite living in the world of men, where death and betrayal was common, Legolas was able to keep a part of him young. Legolas looked up, and their eyes met. Self-consciously, his son glanced down and shifted his feet. He quickly turned his attention back to his horse. Legolas was still adjusting to everything, which included having a father. Thranduil could only hope he would soon feel completely comfortable here. He didn't know if he could handle Legolas leaving again, intent on never returning. There was a knock at the door, and Thranduil called the person in without looking away from the window. He heard the door open and someone walk in. "My king?" Captain Arinian said. Thranduil glanced at his son one last time before turning his back to the window. Captain Arinian stood, waiting. "Yes, Captain?" he asked, moving towards his desk. Captain Arinian didn't respond right away, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. "I was just wondering, Herr Vuin, is he staying?" Thranduil stared back at his chief captain. Captain Arinian stood very tense as he waited for the answer, and Thranduil couldn't figure out why he looked so apprehensive. That was the same question he had asked Legolas yesterday, and he was content with the answer, even if it wasn't the one he really wanted. "He is willing to give home a chance, Captain. That is all I could ask of him. He is not completely comfortable yet, but he is giving it a chance," he repeated. Captain Arinian relaxed, letting out a relieved sigh. "That is something, Herr Vuin." His shoulders slouched slightly, as if a heavy weight was suddenly off his shoulders, and Thranduil narrowed his eyes in confusion. "Tell me, Captain, why have you been so—" He paused to think of a word to use. Invested in finding Legolas, Captain Arinian leaned back slightly in surprise. "He is my prince, Herr Vuin. It is my honor and duty to make sure the prince is safe, the whole royal family. He was such a young one when he ran. I had feared for his safety, like anyone else." Thranduil nodded, but didn't move his searching eyes away from the other elf. "That was what I thought, at first. However, I can't help but believe there is something more to it, Captain. You seemed so driven to find him, more than is required of you. I know you cared for Legolas very much, but there is something more that drove you." He watched as Captain Arinian glanced down, as if trying to hide the emotion that was in his eye. But Thranduil saw it. "Guilt," he said in realization. "You felt guilty for what had happened." Captain Arinian glanced back at him, and the emotion in his eyes confirmed it. Thranduil stepped around his desk to stand in front of Captain Arinian. "This whole time, you have felt this heavy guilt? Why?" "I do not blame you, Captain, for Legolas running away." Captain Arinian bowed his head in submission. "I had failed you, my king, all those years ago. I had several chances to check Prince Legolas's bedchambers, but I did not. It is my duty to protect the royal family, and I failed you with your wife. then with your son. I tried to set things right by finding your son. I did not want to make such an erroneous mistake again." "Captain," Thranduil interrupted. He waited to speak until Captain Irinian had glanced back up at him. "You are the most loyal and faithful captain I've had the honor of having in my service. I am privileged to have you by my side. Stop placing the blame on yourself. You are forgiven," he added. He never did blame the good captain, never even thought to blame him, but he knew it was what the captain needed to forgive himself. "I couldn't ask for a better friend." Thranduil stepped back to his side of the desk and faced the window. Legolas was still there with his horse, brushing him down with gentle, loving strokes. "Come here, Captain." He felt Captain Irinian beside him a moment later, and he pointed out the window. "Look," Thranduil ordered gently. "Your son," Captain Irinian said quietly. Thranduil nodded. "Yes, my son. He is home now." "You did it, Captain." "You brought my son home. Why continue to blame yourself when you had accomplished what you wanted to do? Everything is right in the world. No need to feel any more guilt." "I didn't bring him home, Hirvwin. He brought himself home." Thranduil shook his head. "That is not what Lolandir tells me. He said you went out into Mirkwood in search of my son. He said you looked willing to leave Mirkwood had he not been here. You found him and brought him to the palace to await my return." "Thank you, Captain." Captain Irinian's eyes brightened, and Thranduil could see the beginning of self-forgiveness within them. "Thank you, Hirvwin. I could not have served a better king than you. I am the one honored." "You are dismissed, Captain. I believe you have other duties to get back to, correct?" Captain Irinian smiled. "Yes, I do, my king. Good day." He put his fist over his heart and bowed. "Good day, Captain." Thranduil returned with a twitch of his lips. He watched Captain Irinian leave the room before letting the smile out. He was feeling very blessed at that moment, with his son's return and his captain's fierce loyalty. He turned back to the window and watched fondly as Legolas smiled tenderly at his horse. Tomorrow, Thranduil would make the formal announcement of his son's return. Rumors were already spreading, putting the kingdom in an excited frenzy. It was time to confirm those rumors. Legolas seemed all right with it, if not a bit nervous. He turned from the window and sat back down at his desk. Unfortunately, the kingdom and its problems didn't stop just because his son returned. He had plenty of paperwork to go through. Epilogue. The courtyard atop Minas Tirith was completely filled with people to witness the coronation of the King of Men. Legolas stood in clothing and he was still trying to get used to. The fine fabric was softer than the cloths he had always wore before, and the silver crown circlet on top of his head was something he didn't think he would ever get used to. However, the one thing that annoyed him the most was the overprotective elves that came with him, that he was forced to take with him. They seemed to be in the belief that he would run for it the first chance he got. He, admittedly, knew he might be looking too deep into it, but he couldn't help it. He wasn't used to people relying on him or being the center of attention. But today, he wasn't the center of attention. Aragorn was. He turned back to the front of courtyard, where Gandalf was placing a crown on the new king's head. "Now come the days of the king," the Istar announced. "May they be blessed." He stepped back to where Gimli stood with the pillow the crown had sat upon. Aragorn stood and turned to face the crowd. He looked strong with his head held up high, ready for his royal duty. He glanced at the silent crowd before speaking. "This day does not belong to one man but to all. Let us together rebuild this world, that we may share in the days of peace." The crowd burst into applause, and Legolas eagerly joined in, clapping his hands politely and smiling at his friend. They both had come so far since they first met, and they both discovered their roles and accepted them. Aragorn closed his eyes and began to sing, quieting the crowd. Et earelo endorena utulian, sinome maruvan ar hildinyar ten ambar meta. Out of the great sea to Middle Earth I am come. In this place will I abide, and my heirs unto the ending of the world. Aragorn stepped down to greet his friends. Faramir and Éowyn stepped forward with the new king of Rohan, King Éomer. Aragorn smiled and nodded at them in greeting before continuing on. Legolas stepped forward, feeling the twinge of irritation when the group of elves followed him. They placed their hands on each other's shoulders in greeting. Hananle, Aragorn said. Thank you. I am glad you were able to come. I would not have missed it, Melanamen, Legolas said before stepping aside and glancing behind him with a smirk. My friend. As Lord Elrond stepped forward, Legolas saw pain and grief shoot across his friend's eyes, without really understanding why, until the Elf Lord stepped aside and a flag-bearer stepped forward with a graceful step. As the standard moved, Legolas saw the grief turn to amazement and elation as Aragorn stepped forward. Legolas had heard rumors of the love between the Edain and the Elf Maid, but to see it before him then brought tears to his eyes and a chuckle as Aragorn wasted no time in surging forward for a kiss. The she-elf must be Lady Arwen. Aragorn had spoken of her before. Legolas looked away with a pleased smile to give them some amount of privacy as the crowd cheered. When he glanced back up, Aragorn had continued walking, with Arwen by his side. Legolas stepped forward so he could continue to watch Aragorn walk until he stopped in front of the 4 hobbits. The 4 of them bowed awkwardly. Legolas grinned at them, amused that they were not sure what to do. He was once in their position, just a few months ago. My friends, Aragorn said, you bow to no one. Aragorn then bowed before them, with Arwen bowing with him. Since the king was bowing, everyone else followed soon behind him. Legolas got to his knees as well and bowed his head. Later that evening, Legolas stood by the window of the Mirkwood, or the Hall of Feasts, with a drink in his hand, watching the merry celebration. He chuckled at the obviously drunk dwarf who was trying to impress several little children with tales of the adventures of the Fellowship. He over-exaggerated some of the stories and outright lied about some, just to get some giggles. He had a circle of interested children sitting around him. Some of them were taller than him, but they were all leaning in eagerly to hear his words, gasping and laughing at all the right parts. He moved his eyes to the dance floor, and he quickly found Merry and Pippin doing some sort of jig in the middle. A circle of people around the beat, clapping with the beat and laughing. Gandalf was sitting at one of the tables at the edge of the dance floor, smoking a pipe and shaking his head at the foolishness the hobbits. But Legolas could see the sparkle in his eye, letting him know that Gandalf was just as amused as everyone else. Frodo and Sam was sitting at the table with Gandalf, laughing. Closer to the musicians, Faramir and Éowyn was dancing. They both a spark in their eye as they stared at each other. Éomer was eating at a table with a bunch of other Rohirrim soldiers. They were talking loudly and would once in a while burst out with a bear-like laughter. Elves were scattered around the hall, more reserved in their enjoyment. The Lady Arwen was dancing with her father, and Aragorn, Legolas, turned just as Aragorn walked up to him. He stared around the merry crowd and smiled. This will no longer be such a rare sight. Legolas returned the smile and shook his head. No, it will not, he agreed. I see everything went well in Mirkwood, Aragorn commented as he leaned against the windowsill. Legolas leaned beside him and nodded. I'm still trying to adjust to it, but I'm glad to have found my father. Thank you for your advice. I do not think I would have returned so soon had you not given me those words of wisdom. Then I am glad I said them. You deserve a family. Tell me how the announcement went." Legolas groaned. Awkwardly. He chuckled in remembrance. I did not know what to do or to say. Adar wanted me to give some sort of speech, but no words came to me. I just said I was glad to be back home. Then he crowned me Prince of the Realm. Now I have all these elves following me. They did seem very glad to see me, though. "Fa," Aragorn chuckled and nodded. "Yes, not the best thing that comes with being royal." Legolas chuckled. "You called King Thranduil Adar. You seem to have warmed up quite a bit to him." Legolas glanced down at the floor, almost bashfully. "I haven't called him that in front of him." He glanced up at the merry celebration and took a sip of his drink. Aragorn crossed his arms in thought. Why not? Legolas glanced down at his almost empty mug and shrugged. "I do not know. Maybe because I know things would change once I do." "It would only deepen your relationship, Legolas. It cannot damage it. Don't you want a close relationship with your father?" Legolas sighed, but nodded. "Yes, I suppose I'm not ready for the change. I'm still adjusting, and I don't want things to move too fast." He shook his head. "I don't know. It's been several months. When do you think you'll be ready?" "I don't know." Aragorn raised an eyebrow. "You've been saying that quite a bit in our conversation. I think it is time for you to discover the answers for yourself. Advice from a friend could only do you so much good, but I can't live your life for you. There are things only you could do." Legolas nodded in understanding. "Your words have once again proved to be helpful. It is no wonder you were graced with the king's crown this day, my friend. You do it justly." Aragorn chuckled and placed his hand on his shoulders. "Then heed my words again, friend. Let us mingle." Legolas let out a laugh and nodded. "Yes, wise words." 2 months later found Legolas and his company arriving back in Mirkwood. His father was not there to greet them, busy in his office or in a meeting. Legolas entered his bedchambers and unpacked his pack. He paused and glanced around the room. It used to be his old bedchambers when he was young, but now the toys had been removed and the childish drawings taken down. He changed the colorful setting to something more to his suiting, which was shades of brown and green. He set down his weapons on the chair by the bed before putting away everything. He was in the process of putting away his last article of clothing in the large dresser when there was a knock on the door. Thinking it was a servant to take away his dirty clothes, he told them to enter without turning around. He heard the door open and close as he finished hanging up his tunic. He closed the door and turned around. He blinked in surprise when he saw it wasn't a servant standing there. "King Thranduil," he greeted, trying to keep back his surprise. The stern-looking king nodded in greeting as he walked closer. "I came to hear how your journey went and to apologize for not being there to greet you on your return. I was stuck in a meeting." Legolas glanced over in interest. "What was the meeting about, if you don't mind me asking?" "We are debating if we should take down the dome now that we haven't seen a single spider or orc in this forest for nearly 3 months. It would be nice to feel the natural sun on my face," Legolas said. King Thranduil nodded in agreement. "Yes, it would be nice." "The journey went well, sire," Legolas finally answered. "So, Lord Aragorn is now King Elisar Telcontar." "Yes," Legolas finished. It was a gay celebration. The king sat down on the bed and invited Legolas to join him. Legolas hesitated only for a quick moment before sitting down next to him. "Legolas, I have something of yours that should be returned to you." The king reached back into his belt and pulled out a dagger. Legolas' eyes widened as he carefully took the familiar dagger from his father. "My dagger. I thought I lost this during the battle at the Black Gate." He pulled out the matching dagger from his boot and held them side by side as if they were precious jewels. He glanced at the other elf. How? Your friend Aragorn found it and gave it to me to return to you. The king looked down at the dagger with soft eyes. I remember giving those to you. He grinned. Your mother was not thrilled. She thought they were too dangerous for such a young elf. She may have been right, but you were such a smart little elfing. You were careful with them. I can't remember a single time where you hurt yourself with them. You loved those daggers even then. You liked to follow Captain Irinian around as if you were a member of the guard. Legolas kept his eyes on his daggers as his father spoke. He couldn't remember that time, but hearing about it was wonderful. It helped him feel like he belonged somewhere that had people who knew him when he was young and could tell stories. He never had that before. He never knew how he came to own the daggers, and there seemed to be something precious in learning their origins. His father gave them to him. There was something I wanted to discuss with you, the king said in a serious tone. Legolas eyed him, waiting. He didn't know if he liked the serious tone his father used. He carefully set his daggers down on the bed behind him and gave him his full attention. My reign of Mirkwood is nearing its end, the older elf said solemnly. Legolas felt his heart skip a beat, and his eyes widened. You're going to cross the sea, sire? He asked hesitantly. His father couldn't leave. Not now. Not when they had just found each other again. Not when Legolas knew nothing of being a king. He couldn't do this to him. King Thranduil glanced away and nodded. Someday soon I will, Legolas. Truthfully, most of us will. The time of the elves are ending. It may take several decades before the elves are completely out of Middle-earth, but to an elf, the years will be like a blink of an eye. When I leave, I'll be taking a lot of Mirkwood's population with me. However, some would stay for a few years more. If you wish to stay with them when the time comes, it will be you they look towards for leadership. I do not wish to give that responsibility to you unprepared. I was hoping you would be ready to take on the full responsibilities of a prince and be at my side, so I can teach you how to lead the elves of Mirkwood. Legolas was barely listening. His mind kept thinking on the concept of his father leaving so soon. Don't go, he begged quietly. He slowly moved his eyes up to connect them with his father's eyes. Don't leave me, Ada. Not yet. The only hint that Legolas had surprised him was the slight widening of his eyes. For a moment, no one said anything as they stared at each other. Legolas didn't know if it was just his imagination, but his father's eyes looked brighter with a hint of tears. His father reached up, and Legolas allowed him to pull him into an embrace. Legolas buried his head into his father's shoulders, allowing the warmth from the older elf to calm him. He felt his father's hand on his back of his head, and his father's chin resting on top of his head. His father moved to kiss the top of his head and said quietly, I won't go until you are ready. I promise, Ion Nin. I promise. My son. They stayed in that position for a while, before Legolas lifted up his head and sat up. He looked at his father and nodded. I think I'm ready, Eda, to take on my full responsibilities, he said more calmly than he felt. His father placed a hand on Legolas's cheek affectionately and nodded. I would be proud to have you by my side, Ion Nin. So very proud. Legolas smiled at the warm feeling inside him, which he could now identify as love. And I am proud to be by your side. He took a breath, and his heart began pounding as he said what was needed to be said. I love you, Ada. His father smiled widely back at him. His eyes were sure sparkling now. I love you too, Ion Nin. I always have and always will. I'm truly home now, Legolas said to his father, with his own eyes sparkling in happiness.